Press record here. Perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started because there is a good amount for us to cover today. We'll do a few housekeeping. If you weren't here last week, we had LGBTQ identities, so we went over gender identities and sexual orientations. If you missed that, it's already up on our YouTube. If you need the link, Craig can drop it in. But today we're going to be talking as if you were in that meeting. So if there are words maybe you're not as familiar with or questions you have, you can always drop them in as necessary. We also will have ongoing questions in the chat. So if you have anything to add, I'll try to look at them in between slides. I am heavily and highly distractible, and so I will try to not look at the chat pod while I'm talking because it just makes me stumble. You should have the option also today to turn on closed captioning. I think it's automatically on for you, but if you need that or want that, there should be an option for you to turn on. I believe it says view full transcript or hide full transcript as the options to turn on those closed captions. It's the CC button, Craig says. And if anyone has any questions about that, you can directly chat Craig about it as well. Also, my last housekeeping thing is in 2022, it is very hard to do a presentation as a presenter while thinking about and having my picture in the corner for myself. So at this point, I wanted to give you a visual representation of your presenter, but I'm going to turn off my camera so I stop thinking about how I look and start focusing on talking to y'all about what matters today, because my looks don't matter, but my brain says they do. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video. And also that should help with bandwidth speed for anyone that has potentially sketchy internet. So it's kind of a 2-in-1 win of making it easier on my brain to not think about how I look. So today we're going to be going over cultivating equal access best practices for LGBTQIA plus neighbors. This will also be recorded and the presentation will be shared for you. I just also meant to say that in the housekeeping notes as well. For equal access, many of you already know this, but in 2012, HUD issued the first of 3 rulings that focused on ensuring fair and equal access to housing for all Americans, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, non-conformance with gender stereotypes, or marital status. That first ruling was equal access to housing and HUD programs regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. That essentially said that housing subject to HUD or fair housing rules should be made available without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. The rule also included a definition for sexual orientation and gender identity and expanded the definition of family in most of HUD's programs. Then in 2016, they issued the final rule, which is equal access in accordance with an individual's gender identity and community planning and development programs rule. The gender identity rule ensures that all individuals have access to many of the department's core shelter programs in accordance with their gender identity. Following what had been previously a practice that was encouraged by HUD, providers that operate single-sex projects using funds awarded through the Community Planning and Development Office are required by the rule to provide all individuals, including transgender individuals and other individuals who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, with access to programs, benefits, services, and accommodations in accordance with their gender identity, without being subjected to intrusive questioning or being asked to provide documentation. We'll go into what that exactly means later, but it essentially means that folks have access to services and don't have to prove their gender identity, whether it be by providing medical records or state documentation. And then lastly, a couple of months after that ruling, they issued a third and final ruling that essentially had all of the same rules, and it just kind of expanded it to include Native American and Native Hawaiian programs. The newest ruling mandates HUD-funded programs to grant equal access to facilities and services in accordance with an individual's gender identity and in the manner that affords equal access to the individual's family. It also states that programs are not permitted to require any proof of an individual's gender identity. This means that no agency can ask for government IDs, therapist letters, birth certificates, gender affirmation surgery documentations, or anything of the like to confirm a client or potential client's gender. Another piece of the ruling states that providers must update their policies and procedures to reflect the requirements, and these must be posted publicly, which we'll talk about later as well. Before we move forward and kind of dive into this, I also want to note that while this is a mandate for HUD-funded programs, it's crucial to not only understand and abide by it, but also really think about how we go beyond that ruling as we aim to provide best care and practices for LGBTQ clients, regardless of if we're mandated to or not. Part of HUD's mission is to give every person and family access to safe, secure, and affordable homes, including ensuring fair and equal access to housing for all Americans, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. HUD works to promote, strengthen, and create opportunities for LGBTQ inclusion in its federal programs and regulations. And this is some of the other Fair Housing Act language that essentially requires folks that are HUD funded particularly to ensure equal access. With Housing First in mind, we need to think about the ways that our programs are ready and able to serve. We need to make sure we're creating low barrier and immediate access options for our neighbors who want or need them, because really by ensuring that we have programs ready and able to serve all populations, we're creating the best program possible, the best shelter, the best services possible. We need to be sure that when someone seeks our services, we meet them where they're at with the best physical and emotional supports that take into account identities that they hold. Our goal isn't to create a one-size-fits-all project, but to create programs that are flexible, adaptable, and responsive to client and household needs, and acknowledge, recognize, and uplift those identities. It's not giving shelter in spite of gender identity or sexual orientation, but giving shelter that the identity is not only seen, but respected and considered when providing those services. We talked about this a little bit last week, but I also want to point it out here as a way to really ground why we're talking about this today and why HUD mandated equal access. There's many reasons that it's crucial for providers to uphold equal access and why it's relevant. Not only is it required, as previously mentioned, but it also fills a huge need. 1 in 5 trans people in the United States have been discriminated against when seeking a home, and more than 1 in 10 have been evicted from their homes because of their gender identity. The average age of experiencing homelessness for the first time among LGBTQ youth is 15 years old. Nearly 2/3 of homeless shelters failed to enroll a trans person appropriately, if at all, once they disclosed their identity. And nearly a quarter of trans shelter clients experiencing homelessness report being assaulted by other residents or staff. Sorry, that's supposed to say or. And really, to begin this exploration today, it's helpful for us to recognize some of the common discrimination practices. Many of these practices are not meant to harm, but may have unintended consequences that can traumatize, re-traumatize, or restrict access for clients that are LGBTQ. The practice of screening out callers that identify as LGBTQ is very common. The reasons that folks do this can vary from like a concern about bringing in a client to a shelter that like say has a high level of conservative or perceived anti-LGBTQ clients and not wanting to endanger the LGBTQ person by bringing them in that environment, or to disrupt the status quo of the shelter environment, or not believing that the agency has best services available for the client. However, the thing to really note about that is it's discriminatory because really what it does is it denies access to shelter and disempowers someone from making an informed decision about what's best for them. An employee may also require proof of gender identity before enrolling a client, and as we discussed just a moment ago, that is strictly prohibited. No matter how the client expresses their identity in dress, hairstyle, or gender presentation, you must provide services based on the gender identity as presented to you. And we talked about that a little bit last time of the reason why that matters. And we can, I believe we'll talk about it in a little bit again, but the idea that someone has to look a certain way is really honestly classes, particularly around trans folks, because access to clothing or hairstyle or gender confirmation surgeries, all of that is usually out of reach for someone that is trans and experiencing homelessness. The next practice that is common is a site manager who enforces project roles differently for a single father household as opposed to a single mother household. And while that's not exclusively LGBTQ focused, it's not permitted. The same rules must apply no matter the gender of the parent and regardless of if they were assigned that gender at birth or not. Continuing with families, many shelters require that a child that is male be removed or moved from a program once he reaches a specified age. Well, again, this policy may have good intentions, it's discriminatory in nature. The other two most common practices are management of housing projects failing to address or inappropriately addressing complaints from LGBTQ clients, and predetermining procedures for LGBTQ clients prior to entering a specific client into services. And the reason why that matters is often when a client complains about harassment from another client, agencies often remove or move the LGBTQ identified client in an effort in their mind to keep their safety. However, best practice is to first ask the client what would be best. If the LGBTQ client wants separation from the harasser, it's best practice to remove that person harassing or move them. So you'd leave the LGBTQ client if they feel safe where they are and ask that harasser to move or make accommodations. And that's essentially because as they enter shelter, you're saying they're abiding by a non-discrimination policy and a non-harassment policy. If the LGBTQ client wants to move rooms or exit to another program, of course that's permissible, but really a lot of these common discrimination practices are having case managers or shelter staff or programmatic staff making the calls for LGBTQ clients without giving them that self-determination. And then the other one is requiring or predetermining special procedures for households that include a transgender person. While that's good to think ahead, it's really not permitted because that client should have the right to choose where and how they access services. So sometimes shelters will reserve a handicap or special or single occupancy room for exclusive use with trans clients or clients with specific needs. But having that predetermined special procedure for a trans client to be in a specific room can do a lot of things, right? It can out them because folks will catch on to a pattern of who is in that room. So even if it's someone with a disability or someone that has a specific mental or physical need or a trans client, if you're making kind of a special permissions room, it essentially outs them. That can create safety concerns. What you'll want to do is have all of the different options to give a client upon intake. So you may discuss with the client the safety concerns of being in the big open room or the bathroom locations or kitchen access or what room modifications are available. But you're really giving them the option to decide what feels most safe and or most normal for them. Only by their direction can an agency decide how to house and what services to offer a client. So we're gonna do an example because I know that that was a lot at y'all. Well, yeah, I'm gonna skip over that. Okay, so the example is I run an emergency shelter for women. My shelter only has congregate sleeping and bathroom facilities with no privacy for any clients. One of the women staying in the shelter comes to staff and identifies as transgender. Do I allow her to continue using the same facilities as other clients? If you feel comfy, I would love for you to chat in what you think you would do in this example based on what we just went over. Okay, we got Craig as the solo yes. And thank you, Craig, for sticking your neck out and offering. That is the right answer too. You would still provide her services. The only exception to this is if that client comes to you and says he's a trans male, you may move him to a men's shelter because that would be in accordance with his gender identity. If a client comes to you and identifies as non-binary, you may ask which gendered shelter aligns best with their gender identity and safety. So I think we will do this part of just taking a moment either to type in or just reflect on the ways that you are proud of what your agency is doing for LGBTQ clients. I think going over all of the discrimination practices may be a little bit disheveling to think about the ways that our agencies may not be doing everything right. So some of the ways that agencies can be doing great things can be including LGBTQ people on brochures and on your website, adding pronouns to agency signature lines, revamping non-discrimination policies, paying for LGBTQ training for staff and volunteers, and so many other options. If anyone wants to share any of the things they think their agency is doing well, I would love to hear them. And they can, of course, be examples outside of the ones I just listed. We have a quiet room. Yeah, gender neutral bathrooms are also a really, really solid practice. Okay. While there's many things an agency can do to support and respect LGBTQ clients, some of the best practices are using trans inclusive language in documents and verbally, ensuring safe and welcoming program environments, practicing confidentiality and discretion, along with creating inclusive and appropriate policy standards for staff and residents. And we'll kind of get into all of those in a bit. So the first one we're going to look over is inclusive language, which I talked about with sharing pronouns. Inclusive language should involve written and verbal communications. If you didn't attend last week's session, I would say it's pretty crucial for you to watch the recording, just because it will give you a lot of the language to ensure that you're using inclusive language. I also want to say that if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community or consider yourself an active ally, it's still important to watch it because our language is always changing. So I want to encourage you to stay informed, particularly because we're only an expert on ourselves. So you may be a part of the LGBTQ community and not interacting with folks that are asexual, or you may not have any close trans friends, or uh, being on top of language is just really important. And I know doing this work for the past decade, there's always more for me to learn. And I talk about my identity in the last one, but I feel even being immersed in community as a queer person, I always have more to learn. Now, with all of that being said, we can look at some of the other inclusive best practices, like being having expanded gender and sexual orientations and identities on intake forms, updating policies and procedures for intake and screening processes, sorry, and educating staff and volunteers on LGBTQ affirming language. Those are all necessary steps for that first bullet point of thinking about how we're paying attention to and creating our intake forms. Additionally, authoring your pronouns and mirroring other pronouns are really important. So rather than asking someone to tell you their pronouns right off the bat, it's helpful for you to start by introducing yourself in person or on the phone with your pronouns. For example, a call on the hotline for me may sound like, "Hi, thank you for calling Hope Shelter. My name is Samantha. I use they, them pronouns. Are you in a safe place to talk right now?" Many times, this is a cue for LGBTQ clients that you're an ally, and they may or may not offer their pronouns back to you. It's important that if they don't offer them back to you, to just steer clear of pronouns unless absolutely necessary. And then once you know their pronouns, make sure you use them correctly. How many times people hear me say that my pronouns are they, them, and then immediately use the wrong pronouns on me? Only be asking and like getting pronouns if you are equipped to use them right, because it is honestly more hurtful for me to think someone is responsive to my pronouns and them not be than to have them not kind of pretend to be an ally. If you do mess up in conversation, just to say sorry, correct yourself, and move on. It's not helpful to expand on the reasons you messed up or say that you've done this training or that your shelter is a safe space. Literally just saying sorry sums up all of that. And then don't do it again. It's also important, it's not necessarily on this list, but I will say it's important to not assume family relationships at this point either when you're doing intake. That includes not gendering partners or assuming someone is in a relationship with someone of a different gender. There is That's just another clear sign during an intake process to an LGBTQ client if you're a safe shelter or person. You can ask in gender neutral ways if they're cohabitating with someone or have family that will also need services by saying things like, are you currently in a relationship? Are you living with anyone? Do you have any family that will also need services? All of those are examples of ways to ask the same thing without saying or assuming the relationships in someone's life. The caveat to asking further is thinking, do I need to ask this in order to provide them with services before asking a question? If the answer is yes, ask and provide context to why you're asking. So for example, when asking, at our shelter, we have two facilities, one for women and non-binary folks and one for men and non-binary folks. What is your gender identity so we can look to see if there is space for you to stay with us? So during intake, during the phone call, I may say, I may need to know their gender identity so I know which shelter to look at for space. If I just ask them their gender identity, that's where we can get some pushback and be like, why are you being intrusive? You're really just telling them that this is to make sure you're responding and doing responsive care. Another trans inclusive language practice is removing honorifics from conversation. If you're like me, you were raised to say ma'am or miss or Mr. or sir as a sign of respect. And while this is well-intentioned, it can cause extreme dysphoria or at the very least discomfort for folks who are trans or non-binary if you use the wrong honorifics. If you call a trans woman sir because she does not appear to look like a female to you or because her voice is deep on the phone when you're doing an intake call, that can create such severe distress. And what we really don't want to do is traumatize anyone. And so what I'd encourage you to do is instead of using language to show respect, I would encourage you to show it through actions. And that can be being polite, being respectful, being responsive, being inclusive with your language. All of those things are signs of respect without needing honorifics attached to them. One of the things, particularly as allies, this is a great way to really audit yourself and think about how many times in your daily life you use honorifics. So at the grocery store, at the fast food drive-in, wherever you are, how many times you assign an honorific and essentially assume someone's gender. What I try really hard to do is really just in my actions show respect and leave those to the side. And then there's other practices on here that are also pretty straightforward. We're going to look here at, oops, sorry, I didn't actually click to the next slide. This has been super funky, so I'm sorry. So as I mentioned on the last slide, expanding sexual orientation and gender identity on intake forms helps us provide best practices to not only the client, but also can give us more data for population-specific funding. You may be surprised how many people self-identify in your community once you give them an option to do so. It's also important to note that on the intake forms, we shouldn't ever be guessing for a multitude of reasons, but we should be directly asking folks or having them fill out these forms so that we give them an opportunity to identify correctly instead of assuming. Right here is one of the many options that are available for intake forms. You can search online and find the form that kind of fits best your needs. The main goal is to remove the option of other and replace it with an identity not listed as just like a fill in the blank option. This removes the taboo of the other and allows clients to self-identify in a way that feels good if it's not listed. It's also important to say what pronoun do you use rather than what pronoun is preferred or what is your preferred pronouns. We talked about this last week, so again, I encourage you to watch it. But really, we want to be sure that on our intake forms, we're not using the word preferred around identities or pronouns because they're just simply our identities. If you use she, her right now or he, him, that's not a preference, that's literally what you use. If you are a male, it is not who you prefer to be, it is who you are. It is just simply our identity. And so making sure that in how we list all of these things, it is just bluntly someone's identity. Additionally, not listed on this example is another thing that you could add or just bring into your case management, which is asking a client what pronoun they use in public. So they may be comfortable asking for a gender pronoun they use with you as their case manager, but if say in the rest of the shelter or in the program or within your agency, even overall, they may want you to use something different. And that can be particularly true for someone that is in transition or in a very hostile environment. So many times in an attempt to ensure the comfort of our clients, we proactively assume their wants, which can honestly lead to unintended harm. So it's important that you and your program do the work to understand the needs of an array of clients and be ready and responsive to their requests. We can absolutely make plans for scenarios, but a client needs to be involved with choosing the scenario that best matches their needs or wants, like we've already said. That can mean not segregating unless requested. So, for example, you may think in a congregate all-women shelter, it would be best to use your single occupancy room for a trans woman client. And while the client may choose this option, you need to ask her what she wants. Would she like to sleep in the congregate area or have her own room? And we'll continue to go into this because that's one of the biggest challenges. We also don't want to out a client unless they say it's okay. That means following the lead on the client's wants through intake procedure. If the client would like you to tell all staff to handle the conversation about their identity with shelter guests, etc., you can steward those conversations or tell other staff, but only with the discretion and permission of your client. In all scenarios and considerations in our project, we must prioritize the safety and well-being of those often discriminated against. First, we need to do so by creating specific non-discrimination forms that we go over in detail with clients. Many times our programs will have specific LGBTQ non-discrimination forms that a client signs upon intake. And what really happens is that we go over those in detail with someone that is LGBTQ or who we assume to be, and then skip over it for the folks that may be discriminating against our LGBTQ clients. These forms let the client know that non-discrimination is required to stay enrolled in services and that your program will and does serve transgender, non-conforming, and non-binary clients and other people who are in the LGBTQ plus community. By making this part clear and thorough, you ensure that every person knows the standards and ethos of your agency. When an issue occurs, your staff will know to prioritize the safety and well-being of those discriminated against. We'll take a second to kind of talk through this one a bit, because many times this is the big sticking point for people who may or may not still hold anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ feelings. They'll want to protect the straight or cisgender client from the discomfort of being around a trans person without thinking about the level of discrimination that trans client likely faces on a daily basis. Many programs will say that they can't have a masculine presenting non-binary person enter their women's shelter because what if it's triggering to women to see someone who has male characteristics. And often that's flawed logic, because really a program may have male staff, male contractors, male children, etc. The fact is, shelter is often triggering and upsetting for many, if not most clients. We're asking a client who is likely going through something that they feel is traumatic, oftentimes homelessness and domestic violence, and we're asking them to live in a building with the world of experiences. They're surrounded by people who may cuss, may be loud, may be overtly and aggressively religious, may be messy, may be angry, may be deeply sad, may be using, may be doing lots of things that can be triggering to past experiences. There is no way to deny how hard that is, but how very common it is. The important thing to do is to say, how do I best serve the client who is being discriminated against? The same is true for a Jewish client who has practices during a holy day and a majority Christian makeup in a shelter, or a Muslim woman who wears a hijab and is harassed. All cases in which someone is being discriminated against, we must uphold the safety and well-being of that person. That is to say, it is hard to do in shelter specifically, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. If we're more worried about keeping the peace than providing the best care for our most marginalized clients, we need to look at and examine where our biases lie. And lastly, no matter what we're doing or what next steps we need to do to make a client informed, we're really offering active, explicit consent along the way. We are not saviors, we are stewards. We are here to provide them a service to their expectations and needs. In order to offer that stewardship, we need to empower and accept their self-determination. Oops. So self-determination is fundamental to all clients and HUD projects. While shelter and project staff may offer accommodation based on safety or concerns or other valid professional considerations, HUD's ruling makes it clear that at no time are staff permitted to require a trans or gender nonconforming client to accept an accommodation because of their gender identity. However, the accommodations should be available to clients based on a variety of factors that can increase one's vulnerability and not just be restricted for use by trans or non-binary residents. Last, however, there may be comparable options, such as a voucher offered for a full period of time the original project site would be able to offer a client, and the client can have access to comparable services and resources via an outreach team or supportive housing option. And some of the room accommodations we may think about, and this applies to if they are staying within shelter, we may have staff offer them a resident room that is within proximity to staff workstations to try to help discourage potential harassment or safety concerns. They may offer access to rooms set aside for residents with increased vulnerability, like we're talking about the handicap or single occupancy room. We may offer an alternate project. We may offer the hotel or motel voucher. All of these options are absolutely options. We just need to ensure that we are giving folks the self-determination to choose what's best for them. Some of the bathroom accommodation options, we're really thinking about the ways to ensure safety. So we can establish a single use bathroom for a client at specific intervals during the day. So we think about staff bathrooms or making a bathroom a single use bathroom. I'm so sorry if you can hear the lawn maintenance outside. We can also offer a bathroom that can be scheduled by any client to request during in use of a congregant facility. We can ensure that toilet and shower stalls have locking doors or at minimum curtains. And for shower use, you may think about implementing a schedule for all clients if it's communal, so that we can have that privacy and safety option for folks. And what that really does is provide a multitude of options based on your program if you have a shelter in a congregate shelter. Beyond the intake, we're going to really look at what is a safe and welcoming environment for folks. Specifically, when thinking about the LGBTQ community, what are ways that we're signaling to the community and to potential clients that our shelter or our program is LGBTQ inclusive and affirming? It's one thing to accept a client into your shelter or program. It's another to celebrate their identity. We can't just begrudgingly follow equal access mandates. We need to work to create an affirming and celebratory environment for the LGBTQ community. Some things that we can think of is, are we including diversity in our marketing materials by highlighting trans and queer people on our websites or in our brochures? Are we describing clients in the media and including non-binary language and trans-inclusive language in our press releases or in our media interviews? How are we talking about clients and family structures? How are we framing those experiencing homelessness, and what identities are we using? How are we portraying them as victims or survivors? How are we showing up for our clients and our representation? And that includes, what about our team makeup? Do we have staff or volunteers that are LGBTQ? If you do, are they folks that give hold identities, such as someone who is Indigenous or a person of color or someone with a disability? Are these intersections reflected in your agency's leadership? What about on your board or your committees? Because really, by having voices in your agency that are LGBTQ and intersectional, your agency can be held accountable and remain up to date on best practices. And what about your shelter? We can think about the ways in which our shelter is set up that is safe for LGBTQ clients. So do you have safe restrooms and sleeping areas? Do you have clear and posted policies that explicitly state the equal access policies of our agency? And just a reminder that that is required as a part of the HUD mandate. Is your agency decorated that reflects LGBTQ identities in your artwork or your posters? Because really, you just want to imagine, if you are walking into your shelter as a trans woman, would you feel safe? If not, what would it look like to have you feel safe? Have you asked the LGBTQ community members, staff, or clients to thoughtfully critique your program? Are there options for them to give you feedback? And the last best practice we're going to discuss today is confidentiality and discretion. As I said earlier, how you serve an LGBTQ client should be focused on their wants. When talking about special accommodations as options for a client, it's important to discuss whether or not those accommodations may out them, as we've said. Because does everyone sleep communally? Because if so, putting a client in a single room may highlight that they have special needs or may out them as trans or non-binary. Do you have a therapy group for LGBTQ clients? If so, does the client understand the confidentiality challenges with group therapy and the risks that come along with being in one if they're not out to everyone in the community? As long as the client realizes the potential outcome of what they choose, you can and should respect what they want. Do they need a single bathroom? If so, do they use the staff bathroom? Is there one that has a lock? What about communal lounge areas? What do you do to support their needs while providing safety if harassment occurs? However, even if a client says they're openly out, it's your duty to not assume you have the right to out them to anyone. When processing an intake, you should ask whether or not they are okay with other staff knowing. What about other clients? What about the health professional they signed a release for you to talk to? All of these instances, it should be explicit and time specific about that release of information if and when you need to discuss a client's sexual orientation or gender identity. And I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but if you were not there, it's just a good side note in this moment to never out family or friends, no matter how close you are to them. We're going to do another example of a client named Gina comes to you to complain about another client who is a lesbian hitting on her. What is the next right step? And if you feel comfortable, I would love to see what you think is the next right step. There's a lot of steps in this, just the next right one after that complaint. Okay, Craig says, get the other client side of the story. I appreciate how brave you are to always be the first one to drop something in there. Okay, I know that this one's a little bit of a hard one because it's the tricky what's the next right step. And these are all, we'll go over this in a bit and we'll send these out, but these are all based on a work sheet that HUD put together. So my answers are based on HUD's answers. So what the next right step to do is to obviously, and it's not obviously, but it's to let Gina know that you've heard the complaint. You have to remind her that you can't confirm or deny the other client's sexual orientation, but that you'll just discuss it with your supervisor. It's important not to out the client nor validate Gina's complaint until you've gathered more information. You can validate the feelings she may be having, but you should not assume whether she's right or not until speaking to the other client, like Craig and John said, and really just gathering more information. Because what we really need to do in these moments is be aware of our biases and think about power dynamics when handling these conflicts. It's that delicate balance of hearing Gina, validating her feelings, and then going to gather more information. We're going to do another one, so if Craig's stepping away, someone's going to have to answer it. Another example is you work at a large shelter that requires that a person use their ID every time they enter shelter. A client named Jeff that had not had the resources to change his ID to reflect that he is male, and he tells you that as he hands you his ID. What do you do next? Lisa says, ask how you can help him obtain the resources to change his ID. Ask how he identifies. Accept the ID he currently has and extend to him any resources for assisting him to change his ID. Yeah, all of those are pretty right on. +1 for Betty. um, really, the only thing I would say for any of this, the next step really is to assess the safety of offering any of those things. He may have tried to explain to you quickly that his ID doesn't match his gender presentation, but you really want to see, are there other clients around that are waiting behind him? Is there a better time for you to kind of talk to him about potentially the resources, and get him involved with the staff that may be able to provide him support? Um, Really, at that point, if you're checking people in and he's just trying to get settled, he probably was just telling you so that he could enter shelter. He maybe wasn't even in the space that he wanted to staff out all of the options. You can, of course, take his lead as far as if he wants to change his ID. It sounds like if he said he didn't have the resources, he's interested in it. The only thing, and it sounds like all of y'all are on the same page, is you don't want to require that Jeff's ID match his current gender expression or gender identity. You want to make sure you don't out him to other shelter residents or decline him services based on any of that information. It sounds like I love to hear we're all on the same page about that, because it can be very hard, and depending on finances, or when you're just trying to have housing, the steps to get an ID are hard. And in Texas, there's the trans legal aid that helps provide name and gender marker uh, free workshops, but even still, depending on what someone's going through, they just may not have the options or the availability to deal with that at that moment in their lives. This is my favorite thing to do when we do trainings, is doing these training scenarios. It doesn't currently have them on their website, but I had swiped them off of the website prior to them taking them down. They took them down during the last administration. And so we'll send them out to you. They're a great option to go over in all staff meetings, or use them as a basis for like a team training. And they have scenarios where you play characters, and then it goes over what to do. And it's just a great way to oh, they're back. Yeah, they are. I love that. That's so good. I wonder if they're the same ones I have. I'll check that. And if they're different than the ones I have, I'll send you out the old ones too. But they're just great tools. It always gets your mind going. It can help you identify gaps in your program, and maybe just have conversations around staff biases, because one of the main things we'll go over in a second is just acknowledging we all have them and how we can be responsive to them. And now that we've kind of discussed a lot of the considerations for complying, we're going to think about how to go beyond and really think about what to do next. So for the next steps for frontline staff, we want to reflect on, really the first thing is whether or not this is hard, but whether or not we secretly or openly don't support LGBTQ clients. Because if so, what do we do when a client comes in that is LGBTQ? If you're reconciling your views, maybe it's best to let your supervisor know that you would not be the best fit for the case manager for an LGBTQ client. Or you may want to have extra supervision as you staff working through how to make sure you're providing responsive support. Because really, I'm a licensed social worker, and part of that is recognizing our biases and making sure we don't do unintended harm. If you're interested in learning more, what can you do to increase your knowledge? Can you volunteer at a local LGBTQ center, or can you subscribe to a YouTube channel that's around LGBTQ identities. Can you read a book by a queer author? There are so many now. Or can you be involved with and fundraise for an LGBTQ youth services? Really being involved in a community is the quickest way to build empathy and understanding of not only their strengths, but also their needs. And beyond individual needs, we want to look at some of these other things listed, like does your agency have anti-discrimination policies? Is it aligned with your COC policies and HUD mandates? And just a reminder again, is it posted publicly where anyone at the agency can see? Are we talking as a staff about how we're cultivating a shelter and program that feels safe to LGBTQ folks? Have you thought about bathrooms or rooms or kitchens, art decorations, brochures, books in a communal library, or other things in your program that LGBTQ folks may need access to? Do you have LGBTQ specific resource lists for clients that give options to good physical health doctors, counselors, housing programs, employment opportunities, and other services for LGBTQ clients? It's important that we, as the agency, do the labor to constantly screen our referrals, because we need to know, does the counselor that we refer to know about non-binary clients if we're about to send a non-binary client to them? Do we know that they're LGBTQ affirming before we assign a counselor? Do we know that the sexual health clinic we're sending our trans female client to knows about sexual health care needs for trans women? We need to be doing our work to ensure that we're not sending clients to places or people who will traumatize or harm them. If we don't have many local resources, we should compile a list of online resources such as web-based counseling services, trans-inclusive Facebook groups for support, trans healthcare books, etc. We need to be thinking about these things long before we get a client in our door who needs those services. For managers and directors, I'd still say do everything your frontline staff is doing, but we also need to be thinking about where we can support the LGBTQ community. If your agency fundraises, can you co-fundraise with a systemically oppressed population, whether it be undocumented folks or LGBTQ people or BIPOC people, as far as community organizations? Can we do group fundraisers? Can we show up at other people's fundraisers? Can we do a volunteer community day if we don't do fundraisers, where our staff could volunteer at an LGBTQ organization? Can we table at LGBTQ events? Can we work with LGBTQ community members to make a diversity committee at our agency? We really want to be creative on how to get our agency community involved, because one, statistically, when we look at all of the research around LGBTQ clients, the way that they feel safe accessing shelter is word of mouth solely. And that is true for a lot of different marginalized populations. Word of mouth and being active in the community is what's going to get you that word of mouth, because no amount of rainbow stickers or LGBTQ affirming brochures will make up for the fact that you're not engaging with and uplifting the community on an ongoing basis. We're gonna just quickly go over some anti-discrimination policies. You'll get copies of these, but they're just some examples of policies for your manuals, but they're not fun. It's just examples of how to make sure that we're doing not only responsive manuals, but also how we handle things like complaints. How are we making sure people know how to let us know that we need to do something better? And not all of these are exclusive to equal access. They're just intersectional to LGBTQ clients. And this is another one that is just an example. And the reason that I kind of skip over these is because really we want to think about what is not only best for our programs, but we want to think about how it's in context with our COC. We want to think about how it's in context with HUD language. We want to think about how to tailor that language for your community, your program, your shelter, and think about how we frame our grievance policy, how we do our anti-discrimination work, because that may expand far beyond what I just showed. And so I don't want them to just be copy and pasting. And this is another thing that I'll send out that's quite hard to see no matter what, even when I do this presentation in person. I usually print handouts because it's just tiny. But what it really does is think about equal access across the full spectrum of services. So it looks at what things we can do to make sure we're encouraging equal access versus discouraging. So one of the examples is a staff person at a project that segregates based on gender, accepts a client whose gender expression does not fit the stereotypical gender expression. So that's what that really means is encouraging someone who says that she is a trans female if she is maybe not doing the gender expression in the way that American society would call her a trans woman. So maybe she still has short hair, or maybe she's still dressing in boxy, quote unquote, men's clothing. If she's not fitting that stereotypical expression, the encouraging thing to do would be to honor and accept her gender identity and make sure that we're doing responsive services for that, and putting her in a women's shelter if we have segregated shelter. An example of maybe not doing the best work would be a staff member moves a non-binary client when conflict arises based on the client's gender identity. So again, it could be discouraging and honestly not best practice if you move or create hardship for the person that's experiencing harassment. So this is another really great tool to use potentially to go over with staff or to use in a staff meeting to facilitate some conversations. If we were, oh, thank you, Jen. If we were in person, we would do this more together to host that conversation, but it's harder to type things in and it's harder to feel as safe when we're in the virtual world. So I don't want to make people feel put on the spot about it. Jen dropped in the link, the PDF of it, and we'll send that out as well. Do you know any specific agencies? I don't, Craig. I don't necessarily know that. At this point, I'm going to invite Hope to talk a little bit more about this next couple of minutes together. Hope, if you're around.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. My name is Hope Rogers. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the COC Performance Manager with Texas Homeless Network. Just wanted to talk to y'all or talk with y'all for a few minutes and hoping to hear from y'all a little bit more about what equal access looks like in your programs currently. So I have a couple of questions I wanted to run through with y'all and would appreciate any participation in the chat box if you are comfortable doing so. So Sam has provided some really great examples of what implementing equal access looks like. And I wanted to hear from y'all about what equal access currently looks like in your programs or at your agency. So if you are comfortable, in the chat. Please share what are some ways equal access is currently being implemented in your agency or in your program. And if you are a visual learner like me, I will put that question in the chat. So I don't see anyone typing. I'll give folks another minute or so. But some of the examples that Sam has provided hopefully are being implemented in your projects, including, just making, ensuring a private space for data entry and data collection. So folks have access to private space to ensure confidentiality, ensuring confidentiality across your projects and across your programming. Another example that was provided was not requiring folks gender on their ID to match their gender presentation. I see Richard in the chat working on gender neutral bathrooms. That is great to hear. Do any other folks have gender neutral bathrooms at their agencies currently? Well, seeing none, but that is great to hear and definitely a best practice and something folks should strive for if they have those resources available to them. Another question, oh, I see Craig. At THN, we have a unisex bathroom that is separate from the other ones. Yeah, that is a great example. Thank you, Craig. So I also wanted to hear from folks a little bit about how staff or volunteers are trained or oriented to policies or practices that ensure equal access. So if you're comfortable sharing that in the chat, I will go ahead and drop that question in the chat as well. Oh, and I see Virginia. You guys do have a gender neutral bathroom as well. That's great to hear. So Richard says, we just signed up for Sage Care training for staff and executives. Very cool. And my last question, how are clients informed of their rights under equal access? If you're comfortable sharing that, please do so in the chat. So BK is saying is clearly stated on our intake form. That's great to hear. Some other examples can include, anything around informing a client of their confidentiality rights would be inclusive of equal access. And then delivering that information in a way that is accessible to that person. And then making that information available to them as needed and as requested. Thank you to everyone that has participated. That was all the questions I had. I did want to make a plug for an equal access agency assessment tool. Sam, if this is already in your presentation, I apologize. Folks will be getting it twice. But if you are curious about how well your program or agency is doing with implementing equal access, HUD has a really comprehensive self-assessment tool available on HUD Exchange. I just put the link in the chat that you can download and complete to see what you're doing well and what areas you might have for improvement. And with that being said, I will pass it back to Sam.
Yeah, and that's a good one, Hope. I think it just fell off the last year. I haven't included it, but that is a really cool tool if y'all haven't used it before. So now that Hope did that part, really the last is just seeing if folks have any questions or answers or not. I mean, you might have answers, but questions for me over anything we went over today. I know that, again, this is harder to do online versus if we were in a room together. And so, but I would love if you have any questions or want any clarification around anything. I'm going to go to the next slide. Not saying that you can't ask questions, but that has my contact information in case you don't have it already. One of the things that I joke about is one of the best ways to be an ally is to watch Schitt's Creek. It's a very good way to like roundabout learn about LGBTQ identities. But so I love to use their gifts because I love that show. Not THN endorsed, but Craig endorsed. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, we can
Sam, before we
end
end the
early.
call, can you drop a copy of your presentation into the chat pod so people can download it?
Mhm. Okay, it should have just sent.
Perfect.
And I'll also plug, I know a good percentage of the people on the call right now, but our annual conference is coming up in September. So if you are available and able to come down to Austin, we would love to see y'all. Yeah, we'll absolutely. Craig and I will get the list together of who attended last week and this week and just send out everything in one fell swoop so that you could pass it out to staff and volunteers for sure.
That reminds me, we need to double back and upload it to the YouTube video too. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, y'all. Well, then have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the little bit of time extra that was cushioned in.
Oh, good question.
I mean, that is definitely the choice of your friend. I think again, like we're talking about responsive services overall, is folks have a choice on how they want their identity to be interacted with and what services they want. So really having the person with the identity lead what services or resources they want to use. But the requirements are HUD requirements. So we have to be able to offer them and to be able to speak openly about them. And the thing, again, to really think about is, you know, a lot of times we'll have a friend or a client or anything else as someone that is close to us that we feel like is an expert, right? So because they hold that identity, and what we really need to think about is that is only one anecdotal person versus a large population of people with diverse needs and wants. So the same way as I'm not an expert on all LGBTQ people, nor is that friend, and the same thing goes for any other identity. Just because I have a close friend that is Orthodox Jewish does not mean that that person is an expert on everything that an Orthodox Jewish person would want. Okay, yeah, I think people are popping off, so we will end it there. Feel free to reach out. Thank you for taking the time to be here and to learn together, and I hope to see y'all at the next one.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.